Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to the Fishbowl. So today we have our guest, Matthew Rabaey. He's a college friend of ours. He waved at the camera. He is not an expert on anything, but he's just here. So
seen enough of their 2 a.m. arguments in my old apartment. So I'm going to be a guest on this podcast, which is now being recorded for everyone.
Yep. Yeah. So today we're talking about, was it virtue as a concept or something about it?
It's kind of just like, you get virtue as a concept, then you get a little bit into like each of our personal lives and our friend group.
Was that the plan? Okay, so this is going to be an Aaron episode. So he'll be leading the discussion. And so let's get right into it. Aaron.
Sweet. So I think put the, if it gets a little closer to us, you know what I mean?
Well, we're not hearing it.
No, I know. There's no way. This audio could be terrible. So I wanted to take an episode, kind of talk a little bit about like the pursuit of virtue and joy in Christian life and what that looks like. And I think a lot of people, especially men nowadays, there's kind of that like that stigma that like you have to kind of like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? Especially when it comes to things that could be faith related or like could be indirectly faith related, kind of like working out or keeping a good diet or like having a good prayer routine and stuff like that. There's kind of that thought of like, okay, like I need to get organized, like I need to make a calendar, I need to make a schedule, I need to stick to it. But then that also kind of takes away where, like, if it becomes, Matthew just got a cat and it's
very curious.
Heads up, I might just be uploading the audio, so they might not be seeing it.
Extra fun. Like the concept of like people need to, like, the first part of discipleship is to hear the call and then respond to it, right? So similarly with cultivating virtue in your life, even though yes, it is an intensive process where like you need to cultivate discipline and like self-mastery, the first thing that you have to do is still hear the call that God has. And, you know, I feel like people don't think about that very frequently because there's the whole idea of like everybody is called to this, so why should I need to listen to a call for? Like everyone's called to take care of their body, everyone's called to pray, everyone's called to, you know, like take care of their business, and like find a career and or like a calling of something to pour their lives out for.
So it's like, is it really a calling? Or
exactly. Yeah. But I think it's really important to recognize the fact that God calls us in ways that aren't, you know, Abrahamic or things like where it's like, okay, like here I'm calling you to do X, Y, and Z that you had like no intention of ever doing in your life unless I like slapped you off your horse in St. Paulian language. And you know, so I think it's really important that people recognize that the first thing that you need to do is to sit in prayer and to listen. And that, in fact, like the things that you're attracted to, like we're all engineers, so for scope of diversity, like we all find beauty in engineering, right? Like it's possible at least, but like the call is on our hearts, you know, like even if like, I was like that sometimes, like I didn't like school that much. But I like being an engineer now because I recognize that God is asking me to find him in this particular place. And he doesn't ask everyone to find him in the same places. You know, some people are attracted to music, to art, to, you know, politics, to a whole lot of different careers. And that is still in itself, like, that's not just your human desires. Like, some of it could be, but it's also a means to find God. And, like, it's a desire and a call that God's put on your heart. So by pursuing those things, you are actively pursuing a call from God, even if you're not thinking about it that way. But that shift in mindset, I think, is really important in realizing that. So if y'all have any commentary on that front.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was looking at is even that, like, I feel like that pursuit of virtue, it's so foundational to every other part of a good Christian life, whether it be like discernment of your vocation, discernment of just like everyday decisions that like you might have to, that might not be the quite way, but like discernment of just like normal life decisions about work, where you're going to live, stuff like that. Like it all kind of comes down to, it's so foundational to have that pursuit of virtue, that ability to like listen to your own heart, to what the Lord is saying, and like being able to read your own feelings, thoughts, emotions, and sift through all of that to then properly discern and then properly pursue the life of virtue that God's calling you to. because we're getting that same call, but like it's made for a very different way for each and every one of us.
Right. I guess nowadays when you talk about virtue, people think it means some kind of like, Herculean like thing above what ordinary people can do. And maybe that's just because like people have gotten like lazy or something. Or maybe it's just because I guess life's not more stressful nowadays than it was, right? But it's a lot more fast paced. So you have to make a lot more split second decisions, or not split second decisions, make a lot more like little decisions than people used to.
Yeah.
And so you kind of lose track of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Because like back like a long time ago, people would have seen virtue as something you worked on, just like you exercise, right? We can get into the philosophical leanings of it here in a second, unless y'all have anything else.
Yeah, I want to go back to the Herculean effort that virtue is, because I feel like that is a very like accurate way. Like everyone's like, oh, it's be virtuous, or like to say that you're like a virtuous in this way is like takes a Herculean effort. But I think a good way of thinking, I think everyone has a like, there's certain virtues that are easier for some people than others,
right?
And so like just to think about that, to like point that out on other people, like, man, like this, I can see this virtue comes easily for you, and like versus like, or even like reflecting on yourself. And I had an interesting conversation at my workplace where someone said to me, it's like, man, you're like, you have like, you're really a humble person, which like they're not Christian or anything like that, but just like seeing that like pointed out, like it really kind of, it shows that like, yeah, some of the virtue, it comes naturally to you. And so it's not a Herculean. And some virtues that you particularly are not inclined to practice, like, yeah, it might be a little Herculean, but like just knowing that virtue as a whole, like there's some that are very accessible to you and that you're naturally virtuous already. And then just that extra steps to take those other virtues and pursue those. I think
and the whole theory behind it is that even if it's hard for you at first, as you make the decision, it gets easier, like just like it was any other skill, right?
Yep. And I know I've heard it say like, you start a new hobby, and unfortunately, you're gonna have to be bad at the new hobby before you get good at it, right? It's gonna take like 1,000 hours to master it or whatever.
Right.
That kind of idea, like you're gonna be bad at it first.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
I think something that's really interesting, kind of going back to what you were saying about the part of like the world being so chaotic nowadays, there's probably a very real like part of it that is because we have so many little choices to make now, like we have so many options and things that like for like don't really matter, like I can get like so many different types of food,
right?
Like I have to make like those choices every day, and they're not really like big choices, but when you're just constantly bombarded with tiny little choices that don't really matter, eventually you're going to kind of develop that into the larger life choices where it's like, okay, like maybe this choice doesn't matter as much as I think it does. Maybe, like kind of like trivializing the amount of freedom that you have because you have so many options that you're just kind of like drowning in them.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, when it comes to things like career and vocation, then I'm sure like most people don't do this. Like a lot of people probably have a lot of anxiety about them, but because of all of those little choices that kind of like build up, I feel like it can be easier to kind of take it and be like, okay, like maybe this choice doesn't actually mean as much as it should or as much as I think it does. And that kind of like pushes back that pursuit of virtue a little bit.
I think it's also like, we're not here to like talk about specific virtues per se, but like even just looking at it, there's so many different virtues and everything. If you even look at like virtue of prudence and temperance, and like, well, there's like the 7.
Are there? Okay.
Yeah, 7 cardinal virtues.
Many ones.
And then like and then they like, for example, like patience is a virtue, right? But like it's not one of the cardinal 7. But it's just a very interesting to see like temperance and prudence and stuff like that. Like like those counteract that. Like that is a virtue that you're having to like then like extra focus on all those little tiny choices.
Right.
And like, that's a virtue that like prudence to like decide what is actually a major choice or like something that's actually a virtuous decision or moral, has like moral grounds versus a tiny decision that doesn't really matter.
Right. Yeah. So. And you bring up a really good point. I wasn't originally planning to talk about this, but I listened to Bishop Barron's Sunday sermon yesterday, and he talked a lot about how like the 4 cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Fortitude,
and then the 3 theological.
Right. But above with the four cardinal virtues, prudence is the head of the cardinal virtues, and that's kind of what we were talking about with the readings at Mass. He talks about how King Solomon, right, like his desire was for wisdom over everything else, because he correctly realized that you fail to be able to exercise any human virtues without the virtue of prudence, which is given by wisdom,
right?
Because you don't know how to use your courage, you don't know how to use your justice, you don't know how to use your temperance properly unless you have that all under the dominion. And I think that goes back to the life of prayer, right? Like unless you put yourself at the calling and under the dominion of God in the way that you're trying to discern things, you kind of lose the effect of you make the virtues into. The virtues can be made into false idols, right? And again, not intentionally, but you let one of them or the other one come out of the constraint that they're supposed to be in, which is under the dominion of prayer in Christ.
Right. So this chart, exactly what it looked like, but it had prudence at the top, and then it had the other three, and like there is a sequence that the three go in. It was like it might have been temperance, justice, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But they all proceed from each other, but prudence is always going to each of them as well.
Right.
And I think the Catechism describes it as prudence is the charioteer of all virtues.
Right.
So it's like the driver.
Yeah.
Like, that's another really cool image.
It's a good.
That's how the Catechism.
Right. Yeah.
Did you want to talk any about the theological?
The Aristotelian stuff behind it? Well, Aristotle's one that named all this stuff, right? And that's where the notion of virtues are like muscles you have to work out at.
Right.
Now the word virtue, it means it translates like manly or something, right? Back then, I'm not sure if it was manly in the sense of like macho,
masculinity, like now masculinity.
Right. Well, yeah, and back then, like manly would have been because men were humans, women were objects, back then. So if something is manly, it's like humanly, right?
Right.
It's like
the general term of man.
Yeah. Well, that too. Yeah. And so it's the way they saw it back then, the way Aquinas saw it, right, is being virtuous is like not just the way you ought to be, right? But it's the way that like you naturally would be, if not for the sin in your life.
Yeah.
Right. So like these things that seem to be like hard that make us like uncomfortable,
right?
Like that's a natural trajectory, and like you're used to things that pull you off it.
Right.
So that's why it seems hard.
Yeah. That's always an interesting dichotomy, I think, within the Christian life, is because you think you like feel like Christians sometimes don't. I mean, it's not really our fault, or like they need more terms, but it's hard to define what the word natural means sometimes.
Right. Well, it has two definitions.
Right. Naturally, if you're being a being that's created by God, you fall into that category of like you would strive for virtue always without the sin of the fall, right?
Right. Yeah.
However, because we are now naturally, in the secular term, fallen humans, it's our natural inclination is going to be to sin because we're trapped in that. And I thought it was really cool. Bishop Barron, he talked a lot about the Greek of how the word for concupiscence was basically akin to the Greek translation is like addiction, essentially, rather than being, whatever people think of today.
Yeah. Thinking about going back to right when you started, you talked about like the pursuit of virtue and then like the joy of Christian life, or how that leads to the joy of Christian life. I feel like I want to get to that in some sense, of just the like, I don't know, because like we're talking about, it's mostly have to work out, and I don't know. There's definitely a group of people out there who love working out, but there's also another group out there that are like, God, that sucks. Like, it's terrible. So I think it's interesting to like look at that dynamic of like, I don't know. There's the like the attractiveness of that virtuous life, but also just the like what like real joy actually comes from it. I don't know your thoughts on that.
There you go.
And to pivot a little bit, I guess to kind of like bring up the next little section, I guess on that is I have two main thoughts, and one is with Aristotle, right? Like his conviction of friendship, what human friendship was, like the highest form of friendship was two people who fall in love with the transcendent third together, right? Like that was his definition of what the highest form of human friendship was. And so for us and for Christians, obviously you can substitute God. God is the transcendent third, right? That binds us together. And we find joy in friendship. And that kind of talks a lot about how community is the bridge between that like virtue and joy that is experienced because you're living the virtue in community, and that brings you the joy, even if it's the community of the Trinity, whether it's the community of human persons.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a big. And then I don't remember my second point, but you can.
Oh. I don't know. I don't have the second.
Do you have anything? Or not the second.
Oh.
Any commentary on
No.
that?
What's the second point, man? Tell me what we talked about earlier, but I was like,
what was I gonna say?
Like having a child in the.
yes,
Like I said, it's practice. It'd be easier or harder with a baby, do you think?
Yeah. I guess going to the community, the joy, and I think that also points out the like, and I think in our personal experiences, we can all say, coming from a place that really is like a fertile ground to cultivate that community and cultivate virtue together at the same time. Like you can kind of see how they both play hand in hand together.
Right.
And it's really beautiful to see. In some sense, I think especially for men, it's like this is not like by any means a like actual thought that I think almost any man has, but in some sense you like don't want to be left behind. In some sense you see that.
Right.
And like, and yes, it's not the like best reason, and it eventually evolves, but like you definitely see that in the first sense, like with community, others pursuing that virtue. And then you naturally it's like you see how it's supposed to be done. Like when you,
right.
And that's just so easy to cultivate and to like mimic. Like a good example of like when you have those friends and having that large community, you can see like you get to see so many different virtues, right? People are naturally inclined to like some virtues just from how they're raised and their natural personalities and stuff. So it's like a really cool place coming from that large community of Texas A&M, like the St. Mary's Catholic Center, to be able to see where they really play hand in hand there.
I guess going off of that, right? Opposite of virtue is vice. Opposite of a virtuous person is a vicious person. That's where the word comes from. But when someone is really like not virtuous at all, like the word vicious makes them sound more interesting than they, probably are, right?
Yeah.
It's like, think about like, I guess people who don't have much direction in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of your unemployed friend at 2 a.m. sending memes, right? Like, it's like, that's not very exciting, thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not sure if it's exciting because it seems like actively like draining, or if it's just like you see something missing there in someone if they don't have any direction in life.
Yeah.
And so virtues are sort of like actual, not tangible things, right? But like real things in your life that like add to you as a person.
Yeah.
Like more than a hobby does.
Yeah, and I think the opposite of your vicious person is like the unemployed friend. It's like in our personal life, we're all employed, working like corporate-esque jobs in some sense. It's like it's hard to like. It's so easy to come home from that exhausted and just like
veg out,
not do anything. But like, yeah, I don't know. And that has its place, and that's good. But like, there is a certain good sense of having, even in some sense, like a couple days a week where it's like I go to this activity after work, and it like it surrounds you with people, surrounds you with things to do in some sense, which is not even like, and the thing of itself is not the good thing, but it's more of the like having regiment, having something that's like actually refreshing, like in some sense, like recreational, even every single day.
And in that way, you're also like you're relinquishing control of your life a little bit. So you're kind of letting God take the wheel in a sense, right? Like you're like, maybe I don't really want to go do this, or maybe they're just like do something that I know is going to recoup my energy. But like you're putting yourself out there a little bit. I don't know if it's maybe slightly extreme.
I get that. And back to the point of like control, right? I think it was C.S. Lewis or something said like the most irritated you get is when you have something planned, but when you have nothing planned, when something comes up, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess that's like when you try and take control, that's when you get irritated,
right?
So something to that might be a bit potential. Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I did remember my second point actually, and I think that you can kind of get stuck in a rut sometimes when you're thinking about pursuing virtue and you're thinking about like, okay, like it either has to be something that comes completely naturally or it has to be like this super intense, like hard grind that like, I just need to like shut everything else out of my life.
Cold showers.
Yeah, exactly. Not necessarily bad thing for doing it for the right reasons, but
Yeah.
like I think it's important to continue. It's important to continue remembering that like God wants you to be happy,
Right.
and like that. I feel like to me that was like duh, But like some people, whenever I tell them that, they're like, God wants me to be happy, and I'm like, yeah, man, like He doesn't want you to be like miserable all the time.
Right,
And the reality that like when God puts attractions to things on your heart, or even like intellectually, like those are things that He wants you to find Him in. Like those aren't things that you're like, oh, I have to cut out all joy from my life. Like I need to cut out like everything that's pleasurable from my life and just like sit back and grind. Like right. And like the whole attitude of like a joyful Christian lives Christianity well and a non-joyful Christian is not a true Christian, right? That's a mark of the Holy Spirit in the person.
Yeah. And I think
not to say that if you're like unhappy, you're not a real Christian or
well, joy.
Yeah.
You can have a whole debate on that.
Right.
But I was going to something that thought of me is like you look at those attractions and stuff, and obviously like we're broken humans, so sometimes our attractions get like perverse in some non-serious ways also, like in serious ways and non-serious ways. But even then, it's like it comes back to like I think I know when we kind of had this like pre-talk about it, we like all came back to like prayer as like the first step in some sense, like as the most practical step in pursuing virtue. To like, because you come back, you have attractions on your heart, things you want to do, but to like even sift through those, it needs to start with prayer. And I think even like, when I finally created a regular schedule of praying in my life, it was less so even like at first, it wasn't even that like I was constantly hearing God's voice and getting His direction. It was constantly that I was understanding what my own thoughts and like heart was meaning. Like that was like the first thing that really like understood, and you began to learn more so than I learned God's voice. I learned like my own heart's voice first, and that's so crucial in like actually just like sifting through those attractions and stuff. So I think that's also like very critical. Like that's the foundation for joy, for the pursuit of virtues. Like you gotta first understand what your heart is attracted to and like what it's saying. And like for me, that only came once I scheduled that regular time of prayer. And it wasn't necessarily the prayer; it was the quiet that I gotta sit there and think and like not think about my day, but like purposely try to think about, in some sense, myself, which wasn't necessarily right, but that's like kind of how you have to start. I feel like to hear your own thoughts, and then like once you like God, when you sit and do that, God's gonna like break your heart open to then make you look towards Him. I don't know.
It is shocking how easy it is too. Like once that happens, it's like wow, I just had to not talk for 15 minutes.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, no. Really makes you think about like how, like I said, in modern life, you gotta like always be doing something. It seems like so.
There's a lot of noise, so like
yeah.
That was when I went on a silent retreat like a couple years ago, I think, and one of the biggest things that like shocked me coming back from it was like over Christmas break. So like I like got out on New Year's Eve basically, and so I come home from my silent retreat, like haven't talked in a whole week. And then I arrive home and my dad is like watching TV and there's like commercials and like my mom's cooking and like even just like from that week of just like literally having nothing around and like reflecting a lot on like what was inside my own heart and like going to mass every day and making a lot of like holy hours, like just walking into a room with even like that much noise really makes you realize like how many things we intake as humans every day, like and especially if I'm like scrolling around on Instagram or like what you put into your body affects you, obviously, right? Like it forms what's within you the more like what you consume. And I don't know, you like don't really realize how extreme it is until you have a time of like silence where you're away and then you come back to it. And at least I was like, oh my gosh, like this is wild.
Anything else on this?
Yeah, I think the last point was like kind of going with what you were saying in the car when we were like prepping for this was just like, yeah, again, like listening is the first, right? Like pretty much all saints and like everyone in the Bible, like the first thing that they always do is listen, right? Like that was like Mary's great fiat, right? It was like she listened to what God had to say and just said, all right, man, like I'm not gonna ask any questions, like I'm just gonna go do it, like I'm not gonna doubt you, right? And so just like being sure to, if you want to cultivate virtue, if you want to have a joyful life, like the most important thing you can do is just provide the space to listen. Yeah, I know that used to be hard for me when I was young because I was an only child, so I had like a really like intense internal monologue, going on because I would just like talk to myself and like because I didn't hang out with anyone.
And I thought of when you were talking about saints, I thought about the one like Saint Peter when he Jesus asked people say he is, and he proclaims that he's like the Christ. He talks first, and he's like dead on, and then Christ predicts his passion, and then Peter doesn't listen to that, and like,
boy, you're the Christ, but you can't tell me what.
Yeah, it's like that's so human. That's so like relatable. I don't know. It's just like what I thought about there. Like you see like the step, like not listening, you can get somewhere, but like it quickly does not go where you think it will eventually. Like
Yeah, and I feel like that frustrates a lot of people because when you tell people to like, I mean, it's not a bad thing when like people first start spending a lot of time in prayer, they just kind of like get out a bunch of the stuff that they're experiencing and like are learning how to process their like feelings in the presence of someone else, right? But then like I feel like what frustrates most people is that the most important thing you can do is like do less, like it kind of gives like the Pharisee and the tax collector, right? Where like the Pharisee is like, yeah, I'm gonna say like all these Jewish prayers and just kind of like talk to God and tell him how I'm like thankful that I'm not, like this tax collector, which is like problematic.
It's not making me that guy.
Right. But it's also kind of like like the Pharisees thought that they would please God by their flood of words and by adhering to the law in the way that it was given, whereas the tax collector, just says, have mercy on me, a sinner, and basically just provides space to receive anything, right? Like, preferably mercy, but anything. And so just putting yourself at the disposal of like, I'm literally just going to sit for 15 minutes in the chapel and not just like try as hard as I can not to talk or think about anything, right? Like learning how to create that space of silence within yourself is very important.
And it's like the Lord's speaking in your heart more than you think. Well, like it's not. I'm not even gonna say it's like all the time, which it is, but it's like it's more than you think.
Right.
And like going back to my original like experience with prayer, is like once I learned my own heart, then I could understand. Like I vividly remember the first time where I was like, whoa, that was not my voice in my heart, and like that you can understand like, whoa, that was not me, like, and then you like quickly realize like, whoa, that was the Lord, and like just like realizing that you can, like before it's just like you hear a voice in your heart and you don't know if it's yours or God's or Satan's or anyone's, or like, it's just voices in your heart. But once you learn, one or two of like your own voice, then like it can become very clear. Like, wait a second, that was not me. Like that was something greater than I, like that kind of thought.
You got anything else, Brian?
No, I think I'm fresh out of things to say about this.
Okay. Yeah, that was about really all I wanted to get to.
So, yes, that's this episode. Right, okay, we can figure this out. All right, thank y'all for listening.
Yeah.
We're just about to record another episode. So, see you here in a second.